Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this nascent but very action-packed mezzanine debt session, an interesting new opportunity in the Indian investment universe. Before we actually get down to discussing the nuances and hear from the experts, and we have a very exciting blend here because what we have is two gentlemen who've raised money offshore. So investing in Indian assets but raised money offshore, and therefore it gives you a perspective of how India credit is looked at from investors sitting outside of India borders. And we also have Swapnil, who is actually raised from HNIs actually raised capital from HNIs within the country and deployed in assets here, and therefore there is an interesting blend of perspective that we can get on both ends. Globally relevant, especially because in an environment where there is large-scale deleveraging that's happening, and therefore there is space for mezzanine, special situation, illiquid credit by whatever name called, and we'll delve also on that in a bit. Locally, a lot more relevant now, capital constrained credit environment, the corporate bond market, which is not very, very developed already. The banking system, I wouldn't want to use the word obsession, but the banking system which works on hard collateral only, and therefore businesses which have otherwise very sound, maybe asset light, may have the cash flow, may not have the hard collateral to get into the banking system. And therefore there is genuinely a need for such sort of structured debt. The options could be private equity, options could be debt. The considerations around dilution drive actually which way the money is flowing to and what becomes more relevant. So with that sort of a context where now Indian HNIs want to pool in money, want to invest, and there are vehicles available for that, and offshore managers, third party, all lending businesses wanting to relook at Indian assets and sort of deploy money there. It also fits in beautifully on the risk return framework, and I think we'll discuss that as we get started. I'll start with Shishir, who has some serious experience in investing in Indian credit markets. Shishir, when we were discussing before the session, and you'd mentioned that one of the ways, one of the big key things before we get started is mezzanine debt gets perceived very differently. The way it's understood in a discovered market is a very, very different from the way it gets understood perhaps here. So let's get everyone on the common page, and if you could take us through what do you exactly, how do you think mezzanine debt should be understood?
Well, thanks, Arpita. As you rightly said, mezzanine is actually a most widely used word, but I think rarely understood in the right way. What is the thing? It has many connotations, whether it's Western world or India or emerging markets. If you see Western world, mezzanine is a very traditional product, known by the regulators, known by the companies and the investors. It has to be a slice of a leverage between the equity capital and the senior debt, which traditionally will be unsecured, but has at least a protection rights of a lender which is available to any in the corporate world. That connotation is not really applicable in India, emerging market like India, because the laws are here for whatever word is not so tightly enforceable, because of which a lender may not be able to protect his interest over the shareholders. And that's why in India, this has taken a different form. So if you see one of the most widely used word, mezzanine, which is high yield loans, but it is actually gone to the real estate. If 85–90% of the funding in India you see in the high yield sector is all real estate, which actually if you see is a senior secured loan, because they have a mortgage of the property, they would have a cash flows, and still high yield. So in a traditional world, it's not a mezzanine, it's a senior secured loan to a sector which probably is not having access to the bank capital in the real way. In India, that product has been used for long for the real estate part, but what last few years I have seen when I went to the fundraising in the overseas market, we need to expand that horizon. In India, there are such a good healthy growth companies. We see public market going up. We see all the FMCG business, services business, they're all doing good. They're getting good valuation in the public market. It means they are good businesses. But they don't have access to the other form of capital other than the traditional bank debt or private equity or public market. And that's the gap which we intend to fill when we went to the overseas market. We tend to give a leverage which is beyond the bank debt, which is bank debt is actually secured against the company's assets, but there are business value which is much more than the company asset. Especially these businesses which are very healthy, growing businesses, they get valued much, much more than the asset value, maybe 4 or 5 times of asset value. That leverage of equity, you want to leverage on that. So what we provide as a mezzanine is we put a sliver of leverage on the equity value of the business, which actually is secured against not really assets, but getting service from the cash flows of the business. And that what helps the promoter or the company is to defer the dilution, because otherwise they have to dilute themselves either through public market or private equity to fund the growth. To avoid that is what we provide a sliver of leverage in that company. Now, in this space also, there are, if you see in India, there are a lot of, again, a range of the products. There are a lot of traditional private equity funds who try to do structured deal, where they try to protect the valuation gap by doing some discount to IPO structures and all those things, which basically they are taking equity risk, but maybe a protection of a valuation. But there are credit funds who are trying to do a structured deal where they are taking ultimately a credit call on the company, but giving in a form and manner which is helping the companies to substitute their equity. For the PE exits, for the M&A financing, for land acquisitions, where companies expected to bring their own equity and they have no other source but to dilute, that's where this mezzanine comes in very handy. I think that's what we focus on in our fund.
Thanks, Shishir. I think there are two important points apart from, a lot of important points that you made. One is the way in India mezzanine gets associated with real estate, and a lot has been said on that already in the previous sessions, is a peculiarity of the industry for not able to attract the mainstream banking capital. And therefore, despite having a decent sort of a hard collateral, mezzanine being used there. As Shishir rightly mentioned, the definition technically can be a lot broader, and we've just about started understanding that. And the second, which he touched upon, and I think that will get discussed a lot, lot in detail as well, the issues around legal enforcement, because what we're discussing here is the attractiveness of India as a credit market, and in that, your ability or confidence, if push comes to a shove, your ability to actually work on the security becomes very, very critical. Amrish, you've also had a very serious experience in credit investing in India across, actually beyond credit markets as well, so financial services, private equity as well, and I think that gives a very all-rounded sort of a flavor. What I wanted to understand from you, because it's a part of a global desk where a couple of more countries beyond India compete for capital, and so what is the overall framework when you were to evaluate a transaction from India versus the other desks that you see? What are the trends that you're seeing there? Why would people at the margin at all, given the concerns around the legal framework, would want to invest in India?
I think that's a very valid question, at least for lending businesses such as ours, where for us, the Asian market is evaluated, including Japan and Australia, right? So I think the way most of the people, including us or clients who invest along with us, the way the market gets dissected is you have the developed part of Asia, which is really Japan, Australia, Korea to some extent. Right. And then you've got what we would define as EM Asia. And in EM Asia, you have China, India, and Southeast Asia, largely driven by deals getting done out of Indonesia, right? So if you put all these three markets in one basket and you look at the regulatory framework, more or less, I think, from an enforcement perspective for offshore lenders, there are nuances, right, which need to get addressed. And assuming that you get comfortable with whatever is available in that country, then what kind of return thresholds are going to be available in these countries, right? And that's where capital competes, whether it is for a lending business such as ours or anybody else who's investing from a global or a regional pool of capital. And sometimes it's not very easy to do a deal in India because of that, where markets like China, Indonesia, in dollar terms, can offer you returns of, say, closer to 15%, where I think the Indian promoter group has traditionally not offered these kind of returns until there's an arbitrage for themselves, right? Whether the arbitrage is driven by dilution at a much later stage, they scale up get to a level where the valuation kicks in, or the return on equity in the business is such that giving a rupee-denominated 20-22% return is still leaving them with enough return on equity for them to take this kind of instrument today. I think that's the way we look at how we evaluate deals with respect to the country. Obviously, for me, I would love that every deal which we evaluate from an Indian perspective gets done, because for me, my business is India, right?
In
So
fact, I
thanks.
can add on this part
Sure.
because we went to the overseas market for raising investor money to put in India. And for them is always a choice whether they deploy elsewhere in the world or they deploy in India. And they used to compare, why should I put money in India? If I have got, that's in the US, a mezzanine capital fund can raise maybe 9, 10% and 11% also. So they say if I can raise a 9, 10% dollar return, why should I came all the way to India to take a legal risk, which is what you rightly said. Legal is always seen as a negative spot on the Indian market and emerging market, governance issues and all those stuff. Then the way we address this issue when to our investors is, one, the quality of companies, if you do a proper diligence, they are much better in India in terms of leverage ratios, gearing and all. If you see in the Western market, on an average, one of the ratios they typically see is debt to EBITDA, which typically can go as high as 7, 8 times also. For the return, they are talking about 9, 10, 11%. Whereas in India, for a leverage ratio much less than that, maybe 4 to 5 times, you get the better return. So only choice is if you do a good diligence before investing on the good governance companies. That's a fundamental one. The low leverage in India as compared to Western market in the companies. Second, the growth. In India, the companies have a much more growth possibility of making 20-25% growth, whereas Western market, companies are still growing at single-digit numbers. So for a healthy growing companies with a low leverage balance sheet, you're getting a much higher IRR than the Western market. So that's where our pitch is, and the investors really, if they believe in this, what you see in India growth story is all about public market growth. And if you see all the private equity coming in, is because of that. FII money is coming in because of growth aspiration. So what we are doing, we are putting a new product for the growth companies in a more secure manner and a more protected returns. So that's where the investor got convinced about it.
Sure, thanks, Shishir. So what you're basically saying is while you structure the deal in a manner that the legal enforcement doesn't become a reality, and there's enough and more juice in the companies that we see in terms of their financial stack up and their growth opportunities stack up to be able to do that. Now, Ambrish, if I were to come back to you specifically right now, and a lot has been said on real estate, what at the margin, what is it that sounds interesting? Which are these specific sectors, industries, which make sense for the mandate that you have here?
No, so I think one sector which we liked last year, or this year, it's almost over, was infrastructure. But not last mile infrastructure or money for construction finance. I think that's a risk which requires significant amount of domain expertise to understand. And then there were a lot of political and other policy-related issues. I think what we liked really is companies which had a portfolio of operating assets, right? Which had their inherent equity value. And this was a sector which last year as well as in the coming years is going to require a lot of capital if India needs to grow at the rate which we all want it to grow. And being capital starved created a special situation effectively, right? So we looked at deals where we could lend to such entrepreneurs who've demonstrated track record by completing assets, creating value for themselves and if they have external shareholders, and give them money which they could invest in future projects, right? Which were to an extent away from these operating assets, right? So from a bankruptcy perspective or a guarantee perspective. So I think that's an area which we think will continue, because while the equity markets are back, this is a sector which will require so much capital that there's always going to be a pocket for people to lend in these situations and still make a pretty reasonable return.
Sure.
Or lend in situations where now with equity markets coming back, which was not necessarily known to us last year, there will be opportunities to lend in a pre-IPO format, right? Where you could get taken out via a equity event. So I think that's an area which we think is very interesting for, let's say, 2015. And the entire industrials complex looks very interesting to us, whether it is companies in the manufacturing, chemicals, logistics. I think this entire sector, which is, whether it requires some kind of a growth capital, I think with valuations, except for the top tier companies being at levels which they would like, I think most of the larger mid caps don't enjoy that kind of valuation, right? So that may be a bridge capital which they need to get to that scale and then evaluate further long-term capital options.
Sure, thanks. I think infrastructure being of interest is music to, I think, ears to everyone. Being able to attract capital overseas. But that's also still, in a manner of speaking, it's operating asset, though there is an element of the collateral is very, very important for you, and that's a space that you are in. I remember, Shishir, you mentioning that the mandate that you all have also complements this in the sense that a lot of consumer-facing, perhaps IPR backed, may not be
Exactly.
necessarily infrastructure is what is of appeal. So how do you go about evaluating?
So you are right,
transactions?
Arpita. We complement somewhere Ambrish point where we all know infrastructure is the biggest money guzzler in the country today, but that's also hard asset-backed businesses typically get lendable by the banks or the NBFC in the market. But we, being a private equity DNA, we understand the real value of the businesses which may not have any assets, but they are very good, healthy cash flow businesses which have got a growth visible in the mind. So typically the choice for those companies is either to raise equity, or if they can get some other form of debt, that's what they would love to. And we cater that segment sort of thing. As long as the business has a growth and the cash flows to service additional leverage on the balance sheet, irrespective of whether they don't have no assets to leverage upon, we would love to fund them because we really leverage the equity value of the business. And that's what is our USP in the market.
Right.
I think a lot of those services doesn't have an access to the bank capital for M&A financing, for the growth, or for even the private equity exits. A lot of investments have been gone in these businesses in the past from the private equity industry, but they may not be still IPO ready. They want to still defer the IPO for another 2-3 years, but they have got a conflict with a PE investor who wants exit today. That's another need we feel it. We give the money to those companies to help them in getting the PE investor exit and further fuel the growth so that they can hit the IPO market when they really want to be. So those businesses absolutely, we like to do those businesses.
Right. So I think it's great to hear from both Shishir and Ambrish that global capital wanting to deploy despite some challenges that we may have, and India opportunities on credit looking attractive as well. And it fits in beautifully with the space that complements what the bank can do. At this stage, I'm going to draw you in, Swapnil, because you do a lot of work with the domestic HNI investors, where the fundraise and the pooling of money is and investing in the, so how do you go about the deal structuring? That's something that wasn't understood very easily, and we were discussing that communicating the premise is one of the challenges that someone like us would struggle with. Sure. So how do you go about deal structuring? What is your sort of framework on that?
Well, as you said, right, the education is half the battle. Getting good companies to invest in is part of it, but educating the companies themselves about what sort of funding this is half the challenge. We tend to see it in two ways, both mirror images of each other. The first part is the company side, where we try to educate them that this is, as Shishir has already pointed out, it's somewhere between the bank debt and private equity, let's say. Even within the private equity, like investable opportunities where companies can actually tap into VCP funds, we tend to think of companies belonging to one of the two types. One is high growth, cash burning companies, let's say like Flipkart, or the standard VC investments. The other is relatively high ROC, profitable companies throwing out cash flows, but not necessarily having access to enough equity-like capital to grow as fast as they can actually afford to, given the macro setup, right? It's the former, the Flipkarts of the world, which will continue to raise VC funds, and they should, because the returns for the VC investors there are more like 5x, 10x in 2 years, 3 years, as the case might be. The latter, which is high-growth, profitable companies with good operational cash flows, are what we target, where they can afford to pay back the borrowing and the interest from their operational cash flows and not rely on a capital markets event to repay. So that is the educational part of the companies, and that's how we structure the transactions. Never target a company which is unprofitable, never target a domain which is facing macroeconomic headwinds and so on. On the part of investors, which is the mirror image of this, there is a lot of education which is required to tell them that life is not all about debt being a safe and low return asset class and equity being the high return risky asset class. There is, debt doesn't need to be thought of as low risk, but it's simply fixed income. The distinction being your risk could be market risk, which is the case with equities, or it could be credit risk, which is the case with high yield debt. And that distinction takes a little bit of time to educate people about. And often enough, there is a risk of people underestimating the credit risk and then thinking that 17%, 18% is way too good. Why invest in 8% FD? Of course, the wrong approach to think about it. The credit risk is ill-priced, but it's still not zero. So yeah, I guess that's how we tend to go about, both the investees and the investors.
Thanks. I think one of the important sort of flexibility that onshore is available is actually to structure a hybrid transaction. So Ambrish and Shishir work under the constraints of that being an NCD route only. But what we've seen in innovation and structuring, and we've had at Centrum, we've done some structures where it was structured like a convertible. So it gives you an option of a coupon bearing instrument for a while. There's an option of a safety net return if you don't want to convert the option, but if there's a liquidity event happening, and which is now with the public markets getting buoyant, we have actually seen investors and 70-80% of investors opting for the convertible portion for it. And therefore that fits in beautifully from the investment objective as well. So the other thing, Swapnil, when we were discussing, and you mentioned that one of the concerns that we face from HNI investors has been the lack of liquidity in this. And there's some work and there's some thoughts that you've had on this. If you could just share.
It's actually very curious that when we took some of these products to corporate treasuries, they said that, look, we like everything about the product. They understood it, in fact, unlike many individual investors. The constraint was they couldn't invest in anything which was longer than a year's tenure. Many individual investors, HNIs, also didn't want to invest in a paper which is longer than 2 years. Right. Now, if you put them together, you essentially get a combination which is a 3-year paper, somebody wants to hold it for less than 2 years, somebody for less than a year. If there were a liquid market for these securities, we could have essentially got the first set of investors to hold it for say 2 years, and then trade it out to the treasuries, maybe even at a lower yield, and thus getting a total IRR of the order of say 20-21%, besides the coupon of say 17-18. Now that's possible if there were a market maker, because there is no exchange where these could be traded. Most of these are listed, but that's just for the namesake, right? Realistically, you need a market maker, a fund which has the mandate to own these for the intermediate period or interim period of say a couple of weeks, 2 days, 2 months, as the case might be, and worst case to maturity. But we do expect that as investor interest develops and the investor base which holds these securities becomes thousands, if not lakhs of investors, their individual ticket size of say 50 lakhs, a crore, could be small enough to be traded by a market maker for reaping the illiquidity premium, if you will. And if that were to become the norm, we would see a lot more interest in this from even the institutional or corporate investors.
Right.
I think one other thing which probably I would add to Swapnil's point, right. I think so far, if you see this market of HNI is largely confined to real estate backed loans.
True.
Because probably as an Indian, we understand the real estate from our childhood, because that's what we see, feel, and think, and it's very easy to understand the product and put the money on that. I think all the other type of credit products which Swapnil is working upon, which is a cash flow based thing, I think neither the individual has the time and energy to understand those businesses and go through into deep whether there is a cash flow is secure or real or not. And the problem is there is not much of institutional funding on that space that one can rely on, piggy bank on their work. So I think as the institutional money will flow in the mezzanine capital, I think that will also help the channel the HNI money, because they would probably have a much more benchmarks and a sort of piggy bank on someone else's diligence and work to put money into it. Although if you see fundamentally, it's not much of change. If an HNI is happy to put money in a public market in a mid-cap space, how much they do study on that? They really go on a much of a little bit of, okay, maybe listed company would have some material to read about, but not really go deep into it. What we are talking about is in the same mid-cap companies, a much more detailed analysis and the cash flows. But the business risk is same, whether you take an equity call for the market driven or a cash flow based high yield credit call.
So
Right, I
in
would-
fact, we were, sorry to interrupt, we were seeing a fair bit of increased interest in a blind pool sort of products in this space, right? So initially we used to do deal by deal fundraise, 50 crores a pop, 70, 25, as the case might be. As we went to some of the investors with a blind pool of these assets, many of them actually were quite happy about it. Their thought was that if for 1 crore, I used to earlier get access to 1 credit or 2 credits at best, in a pool way I could get access to 10. Right? That will reduce my credit risk firstly, and the same pool can also then act as the market maker that I did mention in the previous note, right? This market maker can then reap the liquidity benefits, premium if you will, and then that can go to the investors as well.
I think that's an important paradigm that you talk about. Ultimately, and we heard, all of us sharing here that the yield curve is flat, very broad. Ability to price that is not very, very easy, and therefore the way the deal is structured, the due diligence part of it becomes so much more critical because there is no external benchmark that you can sort of depend on, and the processes need to be a lot tighter. There needs to be, and I disagree with you a little bit on Shishir on, the two things on the fact that mid-cap equities, yes, but the upside is huge. Mid-cap debt, when an investor looks at it, he looks at it from a debt allocation point of view, high yield for sure, but still a debt allocation. And therefore, I guess what it also does is the accountability of due diligence is so much more for people who are in that space. It's encouraging to hear, and we've experienced it ourselves, that if you've been able to raise money, be disciplined about by ensuring that the cash flows are on time, being able to return some of the monies back, there is an investor confidence in coming and saying that why don't you do a blind pool? I'm comfortable with the diligence that you had on a deal basis. Blind pool, as Swapnil rightly said, gives me access to more than one transactions, helps me diversify, and that's a trend that we are experiencing as well. Now, I think we're managing fine on time, so I'll just do a last one question for everyone, and then we can open it for the audience if there are any questions. Amrish, 2015, and there's a lot of sentiment change that's happened in the last 6 months. Are you actually experiencing that in the credit market as well? And what do you see as the opportunities in 2015 going forward as well?
See, I think equity markets are leading indicator, right? So they're leading us by maybe a good 18 months.
Right.
So on ground, at least our experience has been, you speak to sponsors who are running companies, that improvement is still far away, right? But people want to be prepared for these opportunities. There is opportunity to grow today. So I think the nature of these financings tend to change with the markets also.
Right.
You have to adapt. So today, I think there's still going to be certain amount of scarcity of capital. Not every company who's unlisted is going to go and file with SEBI and become a listed company tomorrow. So there's only that much paper which the market can absorb. There's government which wants to twist it, various divestments. So I think we think this ability to provide financing which can be used as equity or bridge equity still going to be there for a good 12, 18 months.
Right.
And then you'll have to adapt to the market changes.
Right.
So whether then you go after companies who are looking at, like Shishir mentioned, acquisitions, right? Not every company needs to necessarily dilute for an acquisition. Right. Or companies which are then thinking of deals linked to their IPO, right? So one will have to adapt to those situations.
Thanks. And if I were to flip it around and say there is a market that's there, the environment seems to be supportive. What is it that stands between this and making it a much bigger than what it is currently? What are things that you think need to be addressed, especially when you're interacting with the offshore market, for the credit market in India to look a lot better than what it is currently?
So I think first of all, just adding on to Amrish, if you see what has changed in the last few months, especially with the political stability in the country and all, I think fundamentally what we at least seeing is a lot of entrepreneurs who were skeptic of taking more leverage because they were not sure of whether they can achieve the objective of growth what they were sort of looking for, and that's why they were a little skeptical of taking more leverage. In last 6 months, they are more confident of the growth happening in their companies, and because of which they become a little more risk taker. They are willing to take more leverage rather than just diluting equity. So that's the one change we saw in last few months, that the risk-taking capabilities increased for the entrepreneurs. But yeah, I agree with Ambrish. On the ground, financial performance of the companies, I think it's still probably 12 to 18 months to start reflecting that positivity. And to your point, what could be a one factor which could make this credit market more open up in India? I think is the legal framework. I think legally, the way the laws are being interpreted, although they are all defined laws, but the way our legal system has the tendency of procrastinating for long enough and delaying and getting tactical use to delay the whole decision making is what is the biggest negative in the minds of investors. Had it that been more clear and crisp, the way we see in the Western market, I think that will have a lot more money flowing in. I think that's what I would see.
I agree with you. That's the crux of the problems. You make the due diligence a lot tighter, which is positive, but you hope and pray that you don't have to get into a security enforcement sort of a situation. So, Swapnil, your inputs on what is it that will, from a fundraise and fund deployment point of view, what is it that will make it more appetizing for investors as well in India?
Well, I guess little bit more focus on, say, the instrument rating as against the company rating. Conventionally, only companies have been rated, right? And companies do have the habit of rating their loans when they raise funds from banks. Similarly, educating investors about the rating of an instrument as against just the rating of the company could bring about a sea change in their attitude towards credit, I believe. Because often enough, by appropriate structuring of risk and collateral, etc., you can improve the rating of the instrument significantly, and you can even go a little aggressively after guarantees and so on from third parties, which can improve it further. That's something that could really change the perception, besides, of course, greater transparency and enforcement of securities.
Sure. No, great. So what we hear, what we're hearing is both from an offshore investor point of view, including institutional, local HNI investors, domestic HNI investors as well. There seems to be an appetite for the credit market in India. Mezzanine debt as a category is getting better understood. Things could have, for the product innovation and for there to be a wider sort of an appeal, there are a few issues that got discussed that needs to be, especially around the security enforcement that needs to be tackled. But it's heartening to know that organizations are spending time and energy in building the due diligence framework so that it captures the risk return. So with that, I think we've, if there are any questions the audience has for any of the panelists, we'll be happy to take them. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for a very patient sort of hearing.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to now request Mr. Gadge to kindly step onto the dais and felicitate our panelists. A quick group photograph, please. Yeah. Request our panelists to kindly sign the board on the left-hand side. And ladies and gentlemen, we now break for lunch. I'll see you at 2 o'clock. Thank you.